Today's video is going to be a bit of a dive into the connection between the CIA, the drug cartels, and the Mafia. This video excerpt is going to be from John G. Vibes. He's a new creator on YouTube. You can check out more below on the long form. He will do a much deeper dive there. But let's get into the history of all of this, how it's connected, and how it all will eventually all connect into the e-files. So this is bigger. It won't be mentioned here, but as I roll out my videos, you will see how they all connect.
In 1996, a journalist named Gary Webb published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News called Dark Alliance. His reporting laid out something that may surprise you. During the 1980s, cocaine had flooded into Los Angeles, fueling the crack epidemic that devastated communities across America. Webb traced that cocaine back to Nicaraguan drug traffickers who had direct ties to the CIA-backed Contra rebels. The money from those drug sales helped fund a secret war that Congress had explicitly banned. The series exploded. It was one of the first major investigations to spread online, and the Mercury News website crashed repeatedly from the traffic. Many had long suspected that the crack epidemic didn't happen by accident, but now there was finally documentation. Congressional hearings and investigations were demanded, but that's when the backlash came. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post all published takedowns of the report, insisting that Webb was jumping to conclusions. They said he had overstated the case. His editors buckled under the pressure and published a retraction that Webb himself refused to sign. He was demoted, reassigned, and eventually pushed out of journalism entirely. In 2004, Gary Webb's life ended under mysterious circumstances, and the details surrounding his passing are still debated to this day. 2 years before Webb died, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report that quietly confirmed the core of what he had written. The agency acknowledged that it had worked with drug traffickers, that it had blocked investigations, that it had looked the other way while cocaine poured into American cities. The report ran over 400 pages. It got almost no media coverage. So Webb was vindicated, but it didn't matter. His career was already destroyed, and his reputation wouldn't recover until long after his death. The Contra operation that Webb exposed was proven to be real, and it was barely scratching the surface. There was a clear pattern of alliances with drug traffickers that spans continents and decades and implicates the entire government. The pattern started in Marseille, France in 1947. World War II had just ended, and the Cold War, which I recognize as World War III, was beginning. The port city of Marseille was important to American interests because it was where U.S. aid flowed into Europe. The docks were controlled by powerful labor unions, and those unions were dominated by communists, which was unacceptable for the CIA. They wanted to break the communist hold on the Marseille docks, so they made a deal with the Corsican Mafia. These were gangsters who had been running rackets in Marseille for decades. They hated the communists because the communist unions threatened their control of the waterfront. The CIA gave them money, weapons, and protection. In exchange, the Corsicans provided muscle to break strikes and drive the communists out of the labor movement. By 1950, the communist unions were broken and the Corsicans controlled the docks. The CIA got what it wanted, and so did the Corsican Mafia. With their new power and protection, the Corsican mob expanded into a business they knew well: heroin. They set up laboratories in Marseille to process raw opium into pure heroin, and they used their control of the docks to ship it around the world. This was the birth of what became known as the French Connection. Here's how the pipeline worked. Opium was grown in Turkey, where it was legal for pharmaceutical purposes. Turkish traffickers moved the raw opium to Lebanon, where it was partially processed. From Lebanon, it went to Marseille, where Corsican chemists in hidden laboratories converted it into high-grade heroin. The finished product was then shipped to the United States, mainly through New York, where the Italian-American Mafia handled distribution. The Corsican organization that ran this operation was led by the Guerini brothers, Antoine and Barthélemy. These were the same gangsters the CIA had funded to break the communist unions. Now they were running the largest heroin trafficking operation in the world, and they were doing it from a city where they had CIA protection. By the early 1960s, the French Connection was supplying somewhere between 80 and 90% of the heroin consumed in the United States. Tons of it every year flowing through the single pipeline into American cities. There were occasional busts, but for the most part, they could do whatever they wanted. The famous case that inspired the movie The French Connection happened in 1962, when New York detectives seized over 100 pounds of heroin hidden in a car. But for every shipment that got caught, dozens more got through. The big bosses in Marseille rarely faced consequences. The French Connection finally started to collapse in the early 1970s. Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1971 and put serious pressure on Turkey and France to crack down.
We should talk about that for a minute, though, because the war on drugs wasn't what it claimed to be either.
John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's top advisors, admitted this years later in an interview. He said the Nixon administration had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
They couldn't make it illegal to protest, but they could criminalize drugs, which would justify a growing police state that could disrupt the growing anti-war and black liberation movements. The war on drugs was never about public health. It was about political control. By 1973, the French Connection was effectively finished. The labs in Marseille shut down, the Turkish opium pipeline dried up, and the Corsicans moved on to other businesses. By then, the CIA was establishing new partnerships in a region known as the Golden Triangle, a mountainous jungle where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet. For centuries, the tribes living in these highlands have grown opium poppies, and after the CIA showed up, the heroin from these plants was making its way all around the world. Before we get into the drugs, though, we need to talk about why the US was in Southeast Asia in the first place. The official story is that the United States was defending freedom and fighting against communism, but in reality, it had nothing to do with freedom or ideology. Southeast Asia was one of the most resource-rich regions on the planet, producing large amounts of rubber, tin, tungsten, rice, oil, and timber. During World War II, Japan had invaded the region specifically to control these resources. After the war, the United States didn't want to let them fall into the hands of governments that might nationalize industries or align with the Soviet bloc. When the communists took over China after a civil war in 1949, remnants of the nationalist army fled south into Myanmar, which was known as Burma at the time. The Kuomintang, also known as the KMT, was the army that lost the war. They set up camp in the mountains of the Golden Triangle and planned to someday retake China. The thing is, they needed money to fund their army, so they started selling opium. They organized the local poppy farmers, set up processing facilities, and built smuggling routes. Throughout the 1950s, the CIA provided weapons, training, and logistical support to the KMT, hoping they could be useful for destabilizing China.
So I'm seeing a few parallels from multiple war type scenarios that we've had and the reasons why we get into them. I think they just make excuses as to why, oh, we got to do this, we got to, in the name of freedom, in the name of national security. Yeah, I think what's happening, what's coming out in the e-files is showing none of that is the case. None of that. It's all just lies and perpetuated lies to make us believe that our tax dollars was going to something like a worthy cause. Tell me if you see any parallels here as to what's gone on in Afghanistan, what's going on in any of the several wars that are going on now. Do you notice anything?